Yes, and we are live. Welcome, everybody. This is a Jacksonville Architects meeting, user group meeting for the Trailblazer community. And I was very fortunate to put together a very, very important panel for this session. That's why I've decided to broadcast it to YouTube and LinkedIn virtually. So what we are going to discuss today is digital experience security. There have been several articles on blogs and on news channels about how security is very important when you're um, publishing content and you're doing your operations on digital experience communities. And the security aspect, unfortunately, quite often is not uh, put centered and upfront, and people do not consider all the different aspects of security when they are starting their projects. Now, we are going to talk about code and low code. We are going to try and cover everything as uh, security is concerned on digital experience communities, and put in even content on the websites that we have housed in Salesforce. Now, let me just briefly introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andy Enginutkan. I'm a Salesforce MVP, founder of BRD Pro Consulting, and I'm super excited to be with you today. And I have two super valuable guests today. First of them is Matt Myers. Matt is the managing partner of Easy Protect, Adaptus LLC, and he's a CTA, and he has been in consulting for a very, very long time. He has very valuable experience, and he does travel all over the world to get the word out on the importance of security. And he does also international events. So please be on the lookout for his YouTube channel, his participation and sessions in international events. So Matt, could you please introduce yourself a little bit further in detail? Welcome.
Sure. Thanks, Andy. Appreciate the intro. I think you covered it pretty well, but I'll just kind of give my background just really quick. So I've been working in the Salesforce ecosystem about 18 years or so. Started out as a developer and just got into Salesforce and never looked back pretty much. And I worked at Salesforce itself. Was a program architect there, ended up leading the public sector, and then ended up starting my own company doing buyer scanning in Salesforce. And since I'm pretty much in the security realm, I just started deciding to specialize in security. And so, as you know, I recently about to release a book about how people can secure their digital experiences based on a personal story of mine where a customer of mine got some data stolen from their Salesforce. So it's an interesting story, and I'm just trying to get the message out there and how people can better secure their Salesforce environments.
Yes, be on the lookout for that book, folks. Matt's book is about to come out, and I'm sure it's going to be very valuable for most of us here. And another guest we have today is Shobi. Shobi Abdi is the principal architecture evangelist in Salesforce. And Shobi has also been in technical consulting for a very, very long time in several capacities. He's been with Salesforce a long time. I know Shobi from his involvement and leadership in developing the B2B and B2C architect curriculum back in the day. And then he's done multi-cloud enablement now. He went back into the principal architecture evangelist team again, if I say that correctly. Shobi, please introduce yourself in more detail for us. Should be welcome.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Andy, for having me, and hello everyone. So yeah, my name is Shobi Abdi, as Andy mentioned, principal architecture evangelist on our well-architected and Salesforce architects team. You would maybe in the past know us as the architect relations team, but now we're starting to pivot our focus a little bit. So I've been in the ecosystem since 2007. I just say the year now and let people make the math, because every time I said the year amount, it always made me feel like I'm just older and older and older. But spent majority of that time, started out as a developer, deep in all kinds of fun code. Then slowly built myself up to admin, then worked at various SIs, Been at Salesforce for about 6 years combined. I was also at Salesforce back in the day. And the last 3 years of my life at Salesforce, my focus was on exactly as Andy mentioned. My team introduced the solution architect persona into the ecosystem, developed the B2B, B2C solution architect certifications, and then recently joined this Salesforce architects and team in late January to talk about all things well architected, diagrams, and decision guides. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much. For those of you who are watching us on the live streams, please put your questions in the chat. I'm going to be looking out for your questions, and we're going to get your questions answered in this session. If for some reason we missed something, we'll try to get back to you by commenting on the chat log. Now, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then, we're going to take turns trying to get those answers answered. I want to start with the broader definition of the topic. So when using Salesforce data on a website, what are the main security considerations one must be aware of? How do these concerns change when working with a website where users must log in versus having open access? Matt, could you please answer?
Sure. So I think there's multiple different ways you could do websites in Salesforce, but I'm going to focus more on digital experiences because that's what most people are using these days, even though there's still sites and so forth. But I think regardless, I think I'd go back and start what we were talking about a little bit earlier, was just starting with the locking down the data first. I think making sure that whatever people can see, I mean, just because you don't think they can see it from the website doesn't mean they can see it. They can't see it. So I would start with making sure that I have configured Salesforce on the back end correctly, of making sure that people have access only to the data they need to be seeing, making sure my session security is correctly, even especially, regardless if it's authenticated or unauthenticated, obviously making sure that you've just, people cannot, underlying things, people can't get to the data regardless if you think you're hiding it from the UI or not. So I kind of think of it like from the API perspective. Can they get to it from the API or not? If they can't, then you're probably doing okay for the most part.
Thank you very much, Matt. And Shobi, I think many of the concepts in the well-architected framework actually speak to this. What would you like to say on this topic, please?
No, absolutely. And I think one of the key things for those not familiar with the well-architected framework, I definitely urge everybody to go to architect.salesforce.com and you'll see well-architected right up front, right? We kind of bucket and when you look at architect in general, it's about prescriptive guidance for solution health, right? We talk about health in terms of health, not just, okay, is it performing well? Is there, any significant throughput issues? Is it insecure? It's all of the above, right? And one of the first things that we talk about in the framework is under trusted is secure, right? And the thing is, whenever you're looking at the well-architected framework, remember it's from priority top down. So we firmly believe, our engineers firmly believe, and a lot of our implementers firmly believe that security comes first, right? You have to do security. And within security, a lot of people make the assumption that, oh, you're talking about permission sets, profiles, data security first. No, actually, we start with organizational security and session security, right? Because exactly to some of the points that even Matt pointed out, right? Like we talk about digital experiences, right? There's ways of accessing Salesforce, through digital experiences, through communities, but also if anybody here has ever forgotten about a fun technology called Visualforce, or an even more fun technology many people forgot about called Lightning Out, there are other ways of bringing Salesforce data outside of Salesforce, right? So you kind of need to treat all of these the same, regardless of if it's digital experience, which people assume it's because it's on Salesforce, it should be okay. Don't make that assumption, right? We tell everybody to treat every solution the same way from a health perspective. And when it comes to well-architected, security comes first.
Thank you very much, Shobi. Actually, you touched on some of this already, but when opening access to customers, partners, or guest users, Salesforce recommends leveraging the digital experience communities. But I mean, as far as digital experience is concerned, it is not actually directly Salesforce, right? It's a different environment that actually can communicate with Salesforce. And using that environment, we can actually set up configuration to share that under certain rules, to share the data under certain rules with the visitors. So what are the security topics to consider when building this solution? Is this any different than, let's say, any other website or solution that we can build, Matt?
Sure. So I think I first want to just echo what Shobi was saying about session security, because the first and foremost, if you can, so let's start with authenticated. If you lock people down from the authenticated side, so IP security, then you've already shut the door on them. But if you haven't done that, then then you're relying on the secondary and third mechanisms for that. But from as far as the communities and partner and all that, the first thing I kind of look at also, one of the first things is when I'm setting up a community is licensing. Licensing people don't think about, but that drives a lot of things what you can do. So I'll give a great example from, let's talk about authenticated versus authenticated in the digital experience. So guest users, for example, you have the ability to stop them from uploading files. There's actually a checkbox to disable file uploads from the guest user. But if you're now an authenticated user, a licensed user, there's no way to stop them from uploading files short of writing a trigger that's going to block people from uploading files through the data layer. So I think there's other things as far as, like role security works differently in digital experience licensed users versus in internal users. Also, guest user, there's been a long history of how the guest user has been limited in what it can do. So it used to be that from a sharing perspective, the guest user had access to the same role hierarchy sharing model as the portal users. And now the guest user has its own separate sharing model. So I think when you're considering the when your portal design or digital experience design, I saying looking at first off, what can that user do? What is the potential? When you're configuring, what you limit them from a license perspective, or what can they do for license perspective? Then thinking about, I think record level access, and then like Shobi said, what other things like session security can you do as well? Limiting, like there's certain things like people don't think about, like visibility. If I'm in a portal, it's a shared environment a lot of times, so I could see other users in the environment. So do you want your users to be able to see everyone else? There's a privacy issue there. So I think there's a lot of stuff you really should be considering on all aspects when you're thinking about the portals versus thinking about internal users in Salesforce. It's a completely different animal, I think, when you're designing for external versus internal.
Thank you very much, Matt. Shobi?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think a big theme of this call will be, I'm going to echo a lot of what Matt said, and I think one of the big things to keep in mind as well is that, like, one of the core drivers behind prioritizing session security, especially in the Salesforce platform, because digital experiences we consider part of the Salesforce platform. But remember, we've had a lot of different kinds of, I'll use the word legacy capabilities to bring unauthenticated pages onto public websites, right? We've had Visual Force with Force.com sites. Before that, we had Portal, and controls. And the thing is that the company always has an element of backwards compatibility, which essentially means that a lot of those same mechanisms for security may still be present, right? Like there have been a couple of situations where even with base level guest user access, someone had to go and troubleshoot a Force.com site user in order to ensure that it wasn't there. Because if your org is an old org, and we have companies out there that are, they're getting up there in 10, 15, well, not, some of them are getting close to 20. I mean, we're a 25-year-old company, right? So we're going to have some orgs that are pretty old. So as you look at creating those digital experiences and putting brand new screen flows and utilizing Flow Orchestrator, using all this, be sure to ensure that when that session is created, that on that new technology, that some of the legacy capabilities of authentication aren't present, because that can sometimes override what you're trying to do, or it can sometimes add, it creates security gaps where you didn't realize. And even we didn't realize until an assessment needs to be done. So that's why I always urge everybody based on like audit, right? Audit. Like essentially check and ensure that nothing is precluding the ability, like no other session assertions, nothing else is being added. So, a lot of like what Matt said, plus just remember all the legacy capabilities that can live and exist in your org even today.
Yep.
Thanks, Shobi. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
One thing I wanted to add to that, just as well as a great example I was thinking back to, is I've done lots of research on the history of the guest user and how Salesforce has implemented new features to help make it more secure. So one example I think with this legacy stuff is backward compatibility. So when they lock down the guest user's not allowed to be able to have file records owned anymore and ownership. So when Salesforce locked that down, it was only going forward because they didn't want to break other people's capabilities. And so what people didn't realize or didn't think about was saying, well, I need to look at all that legacy data we had here where the guest user still owned that. And I think that's similar to thinking like the site user or other things. So I think it's just always thinking about going forward when new things are being rolled out, what kind of legacy, how does that impact legacy stuff? How does that impact my data, my security, my functionality, my user experience? I think in general, you just got to be looking at that big picture forwards and backwards.
That's a very good point. Actually, that is a good segue into my next question. You've done this for a while, Matt. What are the biggest, let's say, gaps in the market, like in client orgs? What are the biggest crimes that people are committing? What are the biggest loopholes that are left out there? Could you give us some insight, please?
Sure. So I've been as you were mentioning earlier, I've been doing a lot of research, going to shows, just talking to people in the sessions as more of a research mechanism too, of understanding the education level and what people are doing in orgs. So some of the biggest things, I'll go back to the first public facing sites like digital experiences that people are doing are versus like the sharing of data. So whether your guest user is locked down a lot more, but for example, I've seen people create sharing rules to the guest user, sharing data publicly because they would need to be able to read the data maybe for code purposes, but then they're not realizing that the APIs that power Lightning also can use BigQuery data from an API perspective. So if you're sharing all these records to a guest user, but you don't have the UI, your UI is locked down, I can still get to all of those records that you're sharing publicly. Luckily, you can only do read only. I think the bigger one that I've seen is more Apex classes. People also, when they're developing their Apex classes, there for years, it's been the idea of grouping all your classes together by business function. And then in Apex, and for I guess the non-developers out there, so in Apex classes, you have to put a tag, it's called Aura enabled, that exposes that class to be executable from Lightning. And so if you're having all these classes together that are for multiple business purposes, but let's say one is for a power user, one is for your guest user, but in order for the guest user to access that method, you have to add that class to the guest user's profile. Well, now you just exposed all of these methods that were not meant for the guest user to execute. And because, again, the Lightning framework, the way it works, I now have access as an unauthenticated user to execute every one of the Apex classes. And then I've seen people that are writing Apex classes that then could do dangerous things. Like someone had a class where you could pass in a list of IDs and it did a delete without checking permissions. Now, and they also were publicly sharing an object in Salesforce. That's like a perfect, I guess, intersection. I have all the IDs. I have a method that can unrestricted delete records. So I can basically delete all your data from your Salesforce or publicly, or even worse, someone had an Apex class where you could send data in as a fuzzy search and return a list of contact data with personal information. Well, all I have to do is start sending in stuff to your Apex class, and I can get data out of your org that's sensitive. So I think that the rule here is if pretend like everyone in the world can access your data and access your Salesforce's, the APIs. Are you okay with everyone in the world seeing that data or manipulating that data? If not, then lock it down. So like back to the Apex class example, your Apex classes really should be separated by security persona, not business persona. And same thing be true with, I think, everything as far as from a security perspective. So that's kind of my general outlook.
Those are great points. Shobi?
Yeah, absolutely. Like even to this specific question, like it's a resource I'll provide into this one, but Mitch Lynch wrote this fabulous blog on our blog, like Salesforce Architects blog around building flows for guest user profiles. And one of the things that a lot of people may be wondering where it's like, okay, why would I be using a screen flow for guest user? Like one of the baseline use cases that we've seen is scheduling an appointment, right? So like even just base level Lightning scheduler, like there is so much data being manipulated and created in a very simple use case like that, that I think what often ends up happening is that people will go through the function of essentially creating their flows, but not necessarily thinking about, let's just say, errant variables, right? Like, how often does everybody here do a great job of cleaning up all the variables after they've created their flow and assured execution process? Have a look at all the variables that aren't being utilized, right? Because one of the things that'll happen is that when you're creating that screen flow and that user experience, is that now all of a sudden, somehow that data needs to be represented on the UI, somehow, some way, because it needs to make that call back to the system, right? So it's going to preserve some kind of identity data, ID data, right? It may not be readable to you specifically when you look at it from an audit perspective, but folks like Matt, when they do their, like, specific kind of auditing on, like, what are identifiers or UIDs that are being created that the machine understands that it could be manipulated back. Like, you kind of need to be cognizant, even if you're using low code technologies, of like where that errant data is being created, and if it's not errant data, if it's useful data, how is that data being represented on the UI? So does that require doing a, like, an audit of it, like, right click and view source? It depends on the use case, right? Like because one of the great things about that blog post was that it was written for Health and Human Services. It's a federal government service. Because it's federal government, it's going to require extreme forms of auditing, right? It's the U.S. government. They just don't want to put something out there, that for anybody to attack. It's the government. They don't want that. So that's why, utilizing those auditing capabilities. And a lot of people have been wondering, well, where can I find a lot of those different audit capabilities? Well, there's no one perfect place to do it, right? But a lot of different auditing capabilities that exist within the platform are there around threat detection. And the more you look at the secure topic within the well-architected framework, we articulate that to a degree, but from a lot more best practice than that, that's where you look to folks like Matt, who are really showing it, doing the field. But yeah, I would say, like, even though it's low code, even though it's screen flow, like, you have to be cautious on where your data is in the context of that UI. Like, you have to be very cautious.
Yeah, I read that blog post. It's an excellent one. It's on Medium, and I'm sure there are people in the audience that can share that in our chat. Please do share the link. Let everybody read that one. Um, Now, when you're talking about the scenario, that's a very common scenario. I dealt with that myself, appointment setting, and it looks very naive from a distance. But once you're trying to go through all the user stories and requirements, you realize you have to kind of access the availability of the resource in Salesforce. You have to know what resources you're setting the appointment for. Often you want to match the person who's making the appointment with a contact or identity inside Salesforce. Once you go through those motions and you don't really exactly know what you're doing, you are going to be possibly sharing a lot of data, right? So although it looks quite naive and simple, it can cause a lot of problems. And that's what many folks don't realize. And that is the main purpose of this discussion here. We want to raise the awareness around security when creating these solutions. Actually, Evan has a good question related to flows. And, many times when we are developing these solutions, we are using screen flows, and we often run our screen flows in system context without sharing, and we execute stuff inside Salesforce, and that in itself, I think, opens up risks. Evan, could you state your question, please? Come on.
Sure.
Hi,
Yeah,
Evan.
thanks for having me. Yeah,
Please introduce yourself briefly, Evan.
sure. My name is Evan. I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland. I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem since 2012. I'm a consultant these days, and I do a lot of screen flow implementations. So my question is around screen flows that are embedded on Experience Cloud sites that are available to guest users, and those screen flows run in system context without sharing. What API access is being granted to those users? Can they do things like interact with other elements in that same screen flow? Can they access other flows that have not had their access settings overridden, so they're not explicitly shared? with that guest user. So I'm wondering about what API access is dangerous for those screen flows running in system context without sharing.
Who would like to take this one? Matt, you want to take it?
Sure. I think what I don't have I say too in depth as far as I mean, I'll defer to Shobi for like the actual form fields on the screen flows. But what I would do is I'd think of screen flows back to my example with Apex. Think about what inputs and outputs can people affect with those screen flows, because anything you're sending as an input can be manipulated for sure. Because with the Lightning APIs, you can execute a flow just like you can execute an Apex class. So if you can send in an input and you can manipulate the inputs that are for that flow, then you could cause some adverse impacts. Same thing, what outputs of that flow is I think of like chained flows that are parent-child flows. And if you're able to have any of those flows that are, I would say, shared with that guest user or even an authenticated user, they have the ability to execute them just like I could execute an Apex class. So just make sure that you're not sending anything sensitive that you wouldn't want that person to be able to get access to out, and you're not able to send anything in where you can manipulate it, like my example with deleting all those records. And you want to be able to have, or in your flows itself, maybe you need to have some additional checks. If you are having a multi-user type of usage for those, make sure that maybe some programmatic checks on the flow. Can they do that? Like I know in Apex you can do some describes checking their permissions. Are they allowed to create? Are allowed to edit, delete? And maybe you could do some of the similar things with some Apex with the flows as well. So I think that's generally the approach I would take. I don't know personally, if you could actually get into the screen elements. Maybe you might do it within the spec, but maybe Shobi, you know more about that. So
Yeah. I mean, I think to your point, I think the screen almost was scary, but I think you kind of hit it on the head, Matt. It really depends on, like, number one, kind of like that driving design choice of using without sharing, right? I'm gonna guess it's gonna be you kind of brought it up too, Matt. And like maybe you want it like multi-persona, right? Where you want this specific executable class to be utilized by multiple kinds of people, which my first suggestion is don't, right? Don't do that, right? Like if you without sharing. And then the other point you brought up really well is like, are you now all of a sudden adding a bunch of if statements with describes, if this user context is guest user, then do this, do this. If you're doing that, then I'm going to guess you're also probably doing something like dynamic sockle, which if you want to talk about like, the perils of dynamic sockle on guest user, I feel like that's probably an entire chapter in Matt's book, right? Like, sockle injection is very real. I've seen it in action. I've actually done it on purpose and on accident just to make sure that wasn't the case. So I would say typically if you're choosing to go multi-persona, like then, then there has to be a legitimate reason beyond trying to circumvent license restrictions, right? Or just trying to be as, decoupled as possible. Like, because it's like I said, security is number one, right? And you're starting the build of your solution with an insecure methodology. So I would say first thing is, does it override anything to, like, if they're using dynamic sockle, if they're using dynamic describes, they're doing all that, it's hard. It's very hard to like circumvent a lot of those checks because they are hard coded on, the code layer. But, hard doesn't mean impossible. It just means hard, right? And we make changes and updates to our security capabilities all the time, right? Sometimes to make them more, sometimes, we get things wrong, right? So it just happens. So I would say, like lean away from utilizing without in that external context, and just, yeah, or just use with, and also keep using those describes just to add an extra layer of security. And I'll be honest, like if they're using dynamic sockle, maybe avoid dynamic sockle too, or dynamic sockle, and just stick to hard coded. So it's a little bit more secure.
I think our main use case is trying to allow a guest user to do something very simple like create a record. And we don't want to grant access to that guest profile to do that. So we're running the flow in system context so that that action can execute. And I think Bobby has some really good follow-up questions here about like, are there other things we're not thinking of that we're opening up by giving them, giving that guest user the ability to run that screen flow in system context so that we don't have to assign them any other permissions or sharing rules. So yeah, Andy, if you want to kick it over to Bobby, I think he's got some.
Yeah, let's bring on Bobby. For those of you who are wondering, where are we discussing all these thoughts, let's say concerns around security? I actually help manage a Flownatic Slack workspace, and that's where we come together, and then we spend a lot of time trying to help other people resolve their issues when building flows, and then we also talk about all these like technical and interesting topics. So if you want to join us, we are going to share the link with you in the chat. You're definitely welcome to do that. And Bobby, like Evan, is quite capable in code and low code, and he would like to ask questions around how we position the input output variables, and then whether it would make sense to create a single flow versus multiple flows in different contexts, and etc. Right, Bobby? And can you please introduce yourself and your solutions as well before you start?
Everybody can see me, hear me. My name is Bobby Wright. I am an independent Salesforce consultant, and I'm also an ISV partner. I have a flow screen component solution that I have on the App Exchange called the Flow Toolkit, and it's mostly there to make a more advanced form builder solutions inside of Flow. But I also do a lot of other just fun flow screen components. So that's mostly the work that I do. And in particular, I work with nonprofits. And if anyone else out there works with nonprofits, one of the things that we don't have a lot of access to in these nonprofits is a really advanced technical in-house like people. So I'm trying to communicate to my nonprofits like very easy ways to understand whenever you're building these flows and using this great technology. Like these are the things that you should always be aware of in simple terms. So far I'm not like talking about session stuff and getting into the advanced Apex. I can understand that, but I'm really wanting to have this stuff communicated in simple flow language. And so one of the things that I put inside my question here is in the flow best practices. It has a line that says, never leave system mode enabled while an Experience Cloud external user is on a screen. And I don't understand that from a very simple, like just like I understand it from complex solutions where I'm bringing in lots of data and maybe I have inputs and outputs. But if I don't, my example here that says, let's say I have a lead form where I'm just creating leads and I need to add those leads to a campaign because I'm a guest user. And once that lead is inserted, I no longer have access to that ID to then add it as a campaign member unless I turn on system mode. So what is the security consideration that we should be aware of when doing simple things like that? Yeah, that's my main question. If that's not clear, I can go into more stuff, but I'm trying to get that answer.
I guess I can take that first from my perspective, and I'll Shobi. I think just like anything, system mode should be used very sparingly, and you just know that if you're like Shobi was saying, that if you can at all avoid it, don't use system mode for unauthenticated users, just because you're opening the platform up to anything. And I think it's just more about you have to use special care about what are you doing. I'm going to go back to saying your inputs, like or like Shobi was saying, if you're using dynamic SQL or SOQL, like SOQL injection, being more careful, what can people do with those inputs? So do they have any way to manipulate what it's doing with that without sharing in that privileged mode? And so you're opening yourself up to more risk. Not saying that you absolutely should never do it at all costs, but I think great care just needs to be taken into how you're designing those things so someone couldn't manipulate what it's doing. I think we also talked about other things that are more when we previously spoke a while back, Bobby, was like like DDoS type of attacks. So if I have this flow open and I can create leads and assign them to the campaigns, I could automate that, and I can create 50,000 leads, 100,000, 1,000,000 leads. I use up all your data. You lock out all your APIs if you don't have any restriction. I think CAPTCHA works on the front end, but what do you do on the back end for stuff like that? Also, the other thing I was going to go back to was your appointment setting form. So you're creating this appointment setting form. A lot of times those things have a link that you're going to go back to and say, hey, click on this link to reschedule. Well, as an authenticated user, this is actually what my book's about. An authenticated user clicks that link. Well, guest user doesn't have access to any of that. So if you had the guest user shared with all these records and all that to get access to it, then people could just start pulling people's appointments up, and maybe that has personal information on those forms. So that's why, you have to be thinking about that. So, it may seem harmless having a reschedule link, but if the guest user can get to that data, then so can the entire world. So you have to be thinking about what data can see and what things can people manipulate and do in your org with having zero access. At least with someone that has authenticated, you could lock that user out. You could limit them in other ways. But if it's unauthenticated, it's like the whole world has access to your entire org if you don't do things right.
Yeah, and I can speak to some of that as well. Like when you look at the best practices around, like even back in the day with Visualforce and sites and all that, one of the best practices we have is do not use without sharing, because more often than not, we were doing same exact use case, creating lead records, creating contact records, creating data that we just kind of needed to do, and what would more often happen is like it becomes a little bit of an anti-pattern, and that it doesn't necessarily mean that what you're doing is broken in the eyes of Salesforce, because obviously we're allowing for it, right? Like Apex class is a prime example. Why would we even allow for without sharing if there weren't applicable use cases for without sharing? They exist, right? But they don't exist in an ether, right? So I'd say the biggest consideration is it's a best practice, but to not utilize everything in system context, not utilize without sharing. But in those use cases where, you need to do it, like I think the other half of your question about was like, what should we be looking out for if we do, right? That goes to a lot of Matt's points, right? Almost exclusively of like, just you want to ensure that there is not that denial of service attempt where now all of a sudden your small not-for-profit is seeing where they were expecting to be three leads a month, they're now seeing 30,000 in the last 2 minutes, and they're getting ransomed because some organization is threatening to keep doing that every 5 minutes unless they pay them $50,000. Like happens all the time, right? That's why mass flying around the world, So really what it boils down to is if you can't follow that best practice, then that's where those follow-on practices of like utilize, like keep the scope of your variables as focused in the flow as possible. If you're going to use subflow, then really ensure it's working within the same context as the parent flow. And if it is, great. Make sure it's not doing any more than it should be. So I'd say it's probably never not going to be a best practice. We're never going to change that. Like try not to use Experience Cloud guest user and system context, but we allow for it, and there are the precautions you should take. That's at this stage, like lessons learned from without sharing on Visualforce, all that, that's the answer at this stage. That's the answer. In those certain situations in which we know that technology, our side has to solve it, we can't allow it. Like if anybody knows Lightning Locker, I think that's what we called it. We called it Locker Service back in the day, right? What it does is it prevents users from manipulating the parent DOM, which when the product first came out, surprise, was possible. It was very possible to do, right? And there was we didn't put out a best practice. Don't manipulate the parent DOM, right? Like we actually built in a technology allow for it. Now we allow you to deactivate it, but we say deactivating it is a anti-pattern, is not a best practice. So if there are those particular use cases, we're still allowing for it. So I would say we're allowing for it, right? And if you need to do it, do it. But then just keep in mind those other patterns and considerations as you build on top of that. So I mean, that's the only response that, like these days to like what is a best practice, what is not, honestly.
Yeah, one other thing I would also just add on top of that too is just from in addition to just think about DDoS attacks, also think about your data too that's coming in. I mean, there's also there's the thing about data quality. Obviously, you've got validation rules and things like that, but also Think about people that are on the public that you can't control their access and they're not trusted users. I could go in and I could start just loading leads up. Instead of sending 50,000 leads, maybe I send in 5 or 10 with malicious URLs in them. And now it'd be another way I could take control of your org or your systems doing that, and it'd be very, very sneaky to do that, and it'd be harder to catch. So things that you should be looking out for, should you even allow people to enter in URLs in data that's being entered on a public forum, or other things like that? Should you be doing some another level of data validation when data is coming in from the outside world that's unauthenticated, or even authenticated users that are just self-registering users, which are not much better than, or maybe even worse than authenticated guest users, unauthenticated guest users. So.
Yes, very interesting points. First of all, I would like to thank you. This is an incredibly useful discussion. I can't even believe it that we're discussing all this stuff with all these experts. Thank you so much. And, you know, there are so many questions and reactions, a big audience right now on the internet. I'm going to get to those, but before I get to that, Shobi mentioned the use of Subflow, and then the blog post that we have discussed had that, right? So I think the recommendation was, instead of using, let's say, system context on a bigger flow that could be doing a lot of stuff, use subflows and then do focused operations, and then have that subflow maybe do operate in system context, right? You know, not the parent flow. I think that was the recommendation. But then when we were discussing this among ourselves, we were also thinking, if the whole operation that we are performing is not very complicated and broad, does it make a lot of sense to use a subflow? Because then we are going to introduce input and output variables. So that's another risk factor, right? So I guess there is not a perfect solution, right? You know, a solution depends on the requirements of the situation, I would say, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I'll take that one first. You know, I mean, the recommendation around Subflow is it's going back to, like, you know, principally, how do we get back to system level context, right? How do we get back to it? Like, one of the things that, you know, it reminds me of is back in the day, I'm going to keep referencing Visualforce Apex. You could use Apex today. Is there was a period of time where there was a big suggestion and design pattern happening where if you're using public sites and Apex, use more asynchronous Apex. Use more asynchronous Apex because it was coming off the direct running context user. If you had to create data, don't create data within the context of that user. Use asynchronous Apex, run it in batch in the background. So a lot of these kinds of like recommendations that we're making are contextual, right? It's purely simply contextual. I would say from like a variable auditing perspective and just overall security, you kind of need to make that judgment call yourself as to whether or not that's the path to take, right? Like it's more, how do we get back to system context? How do we get the guest user allowing them to do less and having just the administrative capabilities of the machine do more? So that's a lot of what those kind of recommendations drive. It's almost no different than like some of those older recommendations. But in the end, you have to make your own judgment call on your solution.
Yep. I think I'll go on a different route here. Is more to also think about when you are creating those flows and the subflows. I think the inputs and outputs is something you should always be considering, because the more subflows you have, the more inputs and outputs you have to contend with. Also, the question is down of, like, if you're making a gigantic mega flow, that may also be a security risk, because it's hard to understand what it's doing. There's too many routes. You don't know all the things. And then maybe that's even more of a risk. So I think it's really just going back to thinking about the trade-offs. You know, looking at maintain all the abilities, you know, maintainability, scalability, or security as well. Like, I think everything is contextual. Like Shobi said, you have to think about the context. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. But also, you know, you just need to kind of look at the risk and manage that risk. And then I personally like smaller pieces, but that's not always the best way either, because sometimes maybe you have some smaller pieces, but maybe you have some sensitive data that needs to be passed around. Then maybe a larger flow would make sense in the context of a guest user, but not in the context of an internal user. So I don't think there's any silver bullet for this. It's just more of being, I think, intentional on how you're designing your patterns and making sure you're trying to follow not try to use anti-patterns as much as possible, and those should only be your outliers.
Yeah, let me switch to audience questions on LinkedIn and YouTube. I have a question from Yumi Ibrahimzadeh, one of our Salesforce MVPs. He's a Flow Ninja, and then he shares a lot of content, and he has many solutions that he has created. Now, what he's asking, and this is a common use case, sometimes when people deploy flow solutions on a digital experience side, they want to actually pass in parameters using the URL, right? And some of these solutions also use the record ID inside Salesforce to do that. So what are the risks associated with this kind of solution, and what is the recommended approach here?
No, I can go first. So I would say, passing in URL parameters, we could always just kind of begin there. One of the things that I would really want to understand is like where are the URL parameters coming from, right? If it's coming from, let's say, a social channel, right? Like typically we make more suggestions and recommendations on maybe utilizing a post, on that URL param so that those parameters are more secure in the body versus a get. But I would say, you know, if you are using URL params in the context of your flow and your screen flow, it goes back to a lot of what like even Matt talked about earlier, where like what's to prevent someone from hitting that URL 100,000 times, and just keep it going, keep it going, keep it going, you know. So I would number one, like I guess I would just want to understand a little bit more of that use case on using primes because I know it's probably there, but I understand like if there are other ways of doing it. The second key factor around it is simply like when you're trying, when it comes to record IDs and IDs, like remember, like one of the things to keep in mind about an ID is that an ID does give you almost carte blanche access to anything you want to do. That data, right? One of the first things that it could tell anybody who's actually looking to get in your organization is that those first three digits is what kind of object it is, right? If it's, like the contact record, if it's an account record, those are pretty robust pieces of data because that'll have potentially your customer's data in there. And you want to always think about your customer's data first, right? So we talk about contact records in terms of contact, should probably think about it more of this is my customer's information. How do I keep that from getting out to some malicious actor? So that's where utilizing and it's like there are organizations out there that will use like, anonymous UIDs or create IDs using crypto classes and all that in order to get away from essentially allowing that machine to understand exactly what kind of data is being utilized. So there are there are numerous other methods that one can do to create that UI, but like Matt, want to pass it off to you if you have anything else.
Sure. I think to the URL side is I would say again, like what are the parameters doing? If they're just parameters to do basic data input into a record, maybe they're like marketing, marketing tracking codes or something like that, probably not as bad depending on what kind of data could be stored in the field. But then also same thing, there's still nothing to stop them from doing a replay attack or mass attacks on you. So I'll give one example of kind of what we do in our product. We actually do URL blocking or URL scanning on demand. And we do take you onto a Visualforce page to a Lightning component URL parameters to be able to say what you can do. So someone could technically change those parameters, and you would think that they could then do an attack on our page. But what we did is we're using an Amazon technique of making more of a signing of the URL. So then that way, you're basically taking all the components of the URL and basically doing an encryption using an encryption key to take basically a fingerprint of that URL. So then if you try to change that URL and it doesn't match the signing, then of course that that URL is not going to work. It's going to return an error. So if you're going to have more public facing URLs, that might be a better way that you could do to be able to know that the data coming in is what's coming in. But also, again, be careful on the front end. If you're generating the signing key on the front end, then someone else could generate that same signing key and manipulate it. So remember, I think a good example of that is I had somebody one time, they were trying to, I think they were trying to do just exactly that. I was trying to send username and password in and set the username and password on the client side. And so that did no good. So you have to think about what can they do the browser. Maybe a better way is having an Apex class where it's hidden, and then maybe the class returns your URL that has the parameters exactly as you need or something like that, so that they can't manipulate the URL, they can't manipulate your signature, and so that makes it a little bit more secure.
Thank you very much. Now, I see many questions around how do we monitor and provide auditing for this type of behavior. For example, Mike Eaton asks, would you recommend event monitoring? And Arun Kannanur Ravindran also touches on that. What is the best practice recommendation to kind of keep track on unauthorized access, data breaches within experience site and connected systems?
I think one I would say is just for monitoring, Shield is the first thing that comes to mind. I don't know about you, Shobi.
I would say, yeah, the event monitoring capabilities in Shield. I would like one of the key things to keep in mind about a lot of our event monitoring tools is that they'll collect that data. They'll collect when any kind of forum post happens, when a guest user views your page, right? But it's up to you to create that, essentially that plan to, to ensure that, we are maintaining whatever kind of security posture is required for the organization. It's not simply a measure of like, okay, we've got security. Like one of the other parts of the well architected framework is resilience, right? We talk about resilience, like not in the context of what the technology does, what the platform does, which is what secure is all about, but resilience in what your organization can do, right? If you acquire event monitoring and Shield's great technology, great tool, but if you do not put a remediation plan in place, that essentially if all of a sudden you do get an alert that the guest user's hitting a threshold of, let's say, 5,000 in a given hour, clearly something is happening. Something's going wrong, right? It's a precursor, to, essentially like a malicious attacker trying something, or it could be essentially a malicious attacker, not even precursor, could be their attempt because they've found something out or found, it's available. So I would say having that incident plan in place, can ensure that level of resilience. So that's where it's easy to, we can list tools, right? Like Matt, I'll let you go on a tool rant if you like, right? But it's in the end, if you don't have it on paper, how you're planning on responding to it, and getting organizational approval to that process, then because think about it like this: if all of a sudden you do get a deluge of 50,000 lead records, okay, great. What's the wheat from the chaff, right? What's the good from the bad? Who's going to try to who's going to try to resolve that process, right? Who's responsible for it, right? Who's going to triage all that data to see what gets purged, what doesn't get purged, and who's going to work on trying to resolve that happened. So it's yeah, we talked about a lot of the tech, what the tech can do, but this is a little bit of also about what your organization should have in place in order to respond with that tech.
Yep, I completely agree. Actually, that just reminded me of something that that with that echoes exactly what you say, is having the tech is great, but if you're not doing anything with it, I know people that just we buy our virus scanning solution and then they just set it and forget it. But if you're not managing those threats as they come in, you don't have a process for them, then what's the point of even having that monitoring system in there? Yeah, you may think you're protected, but what if something slips through? What if something you just don't, things are happening and great, it's something telling you you have a problem, but if you don't do anything with that problem, then there's no point even having the system in place. So what was coming to mind actually was, if you don't mind, I share my screen just really quick
Yeah,
here.
just a second. I'm not sure whether it's on for you.
Okay. No.
Yes, you can share now.
Okay. Just really quick visual here. So the instant, I think this is a pop thing, especially like with ISO and all that, instant response lifecycle. And so think about what's the life cycle of any kind of security incident that comes to your org. So starting with here, I think preparation, that's kind of what we're talking about, thinking about what kind of issues you could be having coming in, what are your different risks. And then this is more the technology we were talking about, identification. But and then notification, like if you have just identification, well, you don't even know how to if you're just having identification but nothing else, you don't have that notification piece, then all these threats are going to come through. You have a great report, but you're not doing anything about it. And of course, then what Shobi was talking about, containing it, getting rid of it, and then what happens after the fact? Did something actually happen? How do you recover from that? Did data get lost? Do you have to notify customers, or maybe identifying whether or not what was the loss there, and then your postmortems, like what how can you do to prevent that in the future? So if you see here, it's a circle because it's a life cycle. It never ends. Security should be something you're thinking about all the time, but this is something I mean, if it's not in the well architecture framework, it should be too, but something that you should be thinking about at all times and have that process in place. I think that's true with any everything, even just the framework in general, that the best practices are great, but you need a process around those best practices, or they're in some ways almost meaningless, so.
Yeah, and you need to put the process in place, then you need to test it, rehearse it, simulate it, audit it, right? You need to make sure that you are going to react to it in the way you intended when you put this in place. Now, Mohan is asking, would you like to, I don't know whether you want to give an opinion on this, but he is asking what tool solutions you recommend related to security vulnerabilities like Optimizer, Health Check, SonarQube, Checkmarks, App Omni. He threw us a couple of solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a few that I like personally. It just depends. Again, I'm going to go back to, it depends on your use case. What are you looking for? So I think I always like, I mean, Shield is my first go-to, with all the different platforms that they have with event monitoring, encryption, and then App Omni, I think is a nice tool. I've never used it personally, but I've heard a lot of things about it. I think it's very broad, not very deep though, from what I've heard, which is it's still a nice some other insights. You also think about like data backup, and I like Otoserver is one of my favorite ones because they don't only focus on backup and encryption. And one of the things I like about them is they actually don't get access to your data. They have that you hold the key to your data, so it's being encrypted. I mean, I think that's helping with like ransomware, all that kind of stuff. I think there's other insights like just looking at other tools that can inspect your org, understanding are you using best practices. So like another of my favorite is Elements, because they for one part of it from the security, they're going to give you idea into what profiles are being used, how many permission sets to profile. There's a lot of stuff on that side as well. And then of course I'm going to be a little biased, but our tool Easy Protect, since we do virus scanning, I think you should be doing virus scanning in Salesforce as well. Obviously had to give a little quick plug there, but just general, I think looking at back in all seriousness, looking at what threats are you trying to avoid? And then there's a lot of tools out there. Just because you have the tool doesn't mean you're done. You need to make sure that you have those processes in place along with those tools, making sure they're the right tool for your organization as well.
Yeah, I can't recommend any tools, unfortunately, because of where I work. But here's what I will say: like, if you utilize like the well-architected framework, and if you look at the patterns and anti-patterns related to security and incident response, right? I would suggest you look at some of those patterns and anti-patterns and ensure that your tools fulfill on that. Like, I'll just say that a lot of the tools that Matt spoke to do, right? But it may not be one single silver bullet tool to solve them all. But in the end, you should have more than likely a silver bullet incident response plan in place that will have maybe 12 tools, and a bunch of different processes, but at least one resource. So I would say before you go shop tools, except for Matt. Matt's gonna be great because he's already called. But like get that plan in place, right? What does it need to do? What are the kinds of anti-patterns you need to look out for, and what are the kind of patterns it should adhere to? If you're looking for where do I find all these glorious patterns and anti-patterns, you could find them within the well-architected framework.
Yep, great. Huge proponent of that. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. So another question from another of our MVPs, Peter Churchill says, and I think you touched on this one a little bit, Shobi. He says, one solution I'm wondering about is the ability of platform events to run as default workflow user. So maybe the guest user submits data into a staging object, and then we fire a platform event. I think that could turn the whole thing into an async process. So does that provide some kind of security or let's say a next level of comfort there?
Like next level of comfort's always an interesting one to me, right? Anytime anybody who, if you're not an authenticated user, if you're not a human being that I know, besides an IP address that could be spoofed anywhere, like any location, like I'm always cautious, right? You could go the platform event route, where you could create a flow that's creating a platform event, and that platform event exists outside. In the end, maybe it's not providing any payload back to that user, but in the end, like I'm always just like, it's a little bit of like, there's always kind of two paths towards testing, right? Like one towards testing, one towards security, right? Towards testing is having a little bit more of a suspicious mindset, right? Like being a little bit suspicious about what the user's doing and are not doing, especially on digital experiences, So when you test, like even like, because like I'm not specifically saying a platform event. I think it could work, right? The same way you could use asynchronous Apex, you could use actionable Apex in a subflow. It could be the same route. You could literally just post a URL from a flow and have it go out to some other system. You could kick off a MuleSoft integration. I would say first, like before you solve, have that suspicious mindset on the inputs, when it comes to the UI level, when it comes to the data level, and what kind of data is bringing in, always adhere back to the principle of least privilege, right? That principle is part of the framework. It was before we even wrote the framework, and really the core part of it is give just enough access to fulfill in the use case, right? So I'd say if you have that suspicion, keep suspicious in the front end, back end, then platform events could work. A lot of different methodologies could work, but like, it's like for me, it's always like be suspicious, use principle of least privilege. So yeah.
Yep. I think I'm just gonna go back to it depends for the platform events, just like kind of echoing Shobi. It's from my perspective, a platform event is still another input. So you're not going to get the output, but if someone could send, your still platform event is technically it's a record in flight. So, and then that data is going to be an input for something else. So if you're able to send the input into the flow, and then that input is directly populating your platform event and sending off, it's no better than just letting someone just set the input for your flow. So I would kind of more I would probably most definitely shy away from direct input from your flow to your platform event. I would use that maybe to query a record that gets data internally, sets the platform event or logic maybe inside of the flow that would set some of the values of the platform event, but definitely not passing it in unless it's an authenticated user I trust. And even still, there's actually a lot of metrics out there. If you see that some of the largest data stolen in organizations is actually from an internal user, not an external user also. So you want to be careful of that too. So I think just treat everyone with least trust, guilty until proven innocent in your designs, because anybody could be a threat. You just don't know who that will be. So always treat your code with a way of saying that, just remember, thing I've echoed many times is, what can they do how can they manipulate the data that's coming in, and what can they get coming out? And I think that's really the end result here I'd be thinking about as well. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was like just to echo Matt, like he brought up a really point, like instead of saying be suspicious, actually, like there's a new kind of methodology. We've blogged about it a couple of times around the concept of zero trust, right? Is your solution zero trust? Are you building more towards a zero trust, like, methodology and a zero trust architecture, right? Like, so I would say take a look at some of that. We actually just posted up a blog post about utilizing zero trust with MuleSoft. You know how MuleSoft can actually run in the context of zero trust, which a lot of people thought wasn't possible. It actually is possible. So yeah, I would say, redact my thing a little bit. Zero trust on the front end, principle of least privilege on the back end. So, and exactly to Matt's point, it's all contextual. Everything as an architect starts with it depends. So it's always a fun discussion.
Yes, I think one of the important points that was mentioned here is we sometimes focus maybe too much on guest user. Like you mentioned, Matt, we have to also make sure that the logged in users can only access what they need to access, right? So that should be also a main focus there. So one other question is, we talked about legacy solutions. One of the most commonly used legacy solutions is the web to lead feature out of the box for Salesforce, right? Direct input into the org. Mike is asking, should we be scrubbing that data for malicious URLs and things like that when we have forms out there, or is that something Salesforce does for us? What are the concerns there?
I guess I can take that since it's more of my expertise. But I always thought, actually, it's funny. I always thought web to lead and even email to case and also are some of the, sorry, Shobi, some of the more insecure areas of the platform. I mean,
Yeah.
web to lead has your org ID in it.
If you're expecting me to disagree, I don't. So keep going.
Yeah, but I mean, web to lead has your whole org ID. It's all client side. So I'm going to get your org ID just by you using web to lead. And then it's just blindly putting data in, answering the question of URLs. That's why we have a product. They're not Salesforce is not looking for malicious URLs. They're not stopping from DDoS attacks as far as I know from web to lead, unless there's something behind the scenes. I've been able to get hundreds of leads coming in. I actually had a small scale attack someone did on us once, and then I shut it down. So I think email to case is the same way. Someone can send you 10,000 emails, create lots of cases. I think there's just things you can't stop that unless you have like in the middle layer of before that email gets routed to Salesforce, you have some kind of check there. But I think just both of those are ones that I would more shy away from unless you just don't have the ability to do something more complex.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I think Bobby brought it up on chat, but there is a limit on web to lead. And like one of the things I'll say about web to lead is that simply because it has the org ID there, like it exists. It's existed as long as I've been doing Salesforce since 2007, which should kind of tell you the whole story at that stage. Like there are other options besides web to lead. So if your organization's using web to lead because they're cost constrained, it's always a balance, right? It is always a balance of what is the cost of remediation. Like it always go back to, and like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, when it comes to health. So it's a lot of it depends that way. So you have to discern on your case by case basis if it's worth it or not. But like like you admit, it's really insecure, right? It's got the org ID right there. Not a great thing. So yeah.
I think I want to actually, one thing you just said that I talk to people a lot about is the same thing of is it necessary? I think that's another thing to consider in just security. So some people like especially government is really bad at this is one size fits all. You always should have, I mean, just one example, I'll just say like you should always have two-factor no matter what. Generally a good practice, but if that data is, let's say, publicly available, you probably don't even need authentication. But also I think there's another flip side of that too, is because you should doesn't mean you can. And I had someone I was coaching for a while, and she had a company where they had a digital experience community where people could place orders. They didn't have two-factor because everyone that was logging in were just about a retirement age. Most people didn't have a smartphone. Does that mean you shouldn't have MFA? No, I think there's other ways you can do it, like having additional challenge questions just every time they log in, or other stuff like session security built into it. I think there's those two things. There's people who do overkill. I think one of my quotes I've in my book is something like, if you want complete security, go to prison because they're your fed, clothed, and I think there's the third, but then you have no freedom, right? So I think there's a balance in security. Is the youth system needs to be usable, but also needs to be secure. But I think there's only so far you go, because if you go too far, then there's no point even having the system, because no one's going to use it. I had one system that's a customer of mine did. I'm not going to tell you who it was, is years ago, but they spent, I think they lost over $1 million on a project because they didn't understand the usability, and they made the system too secure, too unusable, and no one actually utilized the system, so they had to start from scratch. So I think it's finding that balance that on both sides, which is these things you have to consider.
Thank you. Mahesh, local in Jacksonville here, a technical architect who is on his path to getting a CTA certification, he's asking, how can we limit social sign-on logins to digital experience sites so that they can only access the user's identity without exceeding that? What are the concerns with social sign-ons?
I think I'll let Shobi take that one. It's not really something that's my complete expertise on social side. So
No, that's okay. I mean, I'm gonna assume that we're talking like OpenID capabilities and OAuth. Like I would say, I would treat it no different than any other like OAuth kind of transaction, right? When it comes to OpenID, I know that there are some federal government, some government where they'll use OpenID as their standard for doing it. So, so the way that, you could go about, restricting the amount of people doing it is, number one, if they have that OpenID factor, like, because it'll use just-in-time authentication, like Matt, you and I were talking about, like JIT, Apex handlers and all that. You can always like some of it's not like a magic button. Like you can have like an interceding process in that handler where now all of a sudden, before that user's created, you can create an interceding form in everybody's good old fashioned UI Visualforce, right? To essentially ask a couple of questions on that. And you can add those as like as custom, I believe that there were custom attributes on permission. You can add them as well. So there's ways of doing that kind of interceding check. Like if they're gonna, utilize ID, like I said, you could do an interceding like I know everybody hates CAPTCHA, right? That's why I suggested doing the interceding form first to verify this is like a, like a human being who's going to the right place. But CAPTCHA still exists. I wouldn't suggest it all the time, but it still exists. But in the end, like like in that flow, you can create an interceding process where like when they try, they have to respond with something first, just to assure it's not like a robo like capability or anything like that. So there's opportunities there. So I'm talking less about social, more about the context of OpenID and OAuth and just in time, which is a little bit of a bucket and blanket of. So utilizing those tools as an interceding path towards preventing a ton of people using social sign-on can always be a good path.
Yep.
Thank you. So some of the discussions that we've had also generated a couple of follow-up questions. I would like to ask for Evan to come on, and Evan is going to ask a question. Are you there, Evan?
Yeah, I'm here. So my follow-up was, you talked a lot about there's no silver bullet, but there are good patterns and there are anti-patterns. So I was hoping to get a very specific scenario and see what pattern you would recommend for this situation. So it kind of goes back to Bobby's scenario he brought up earlier. If you have a screen flow that is supposed to create a lead and add them to a campaign, and all we're collecting on that screen is first name, last name, and email. We've sanitized and verified that those inputs are, not exceeding a certain length, and they're like valid formats. What pattern would you recommend using screen flows on an Experience Cloud site in order to get that data into a Salesforce org?
I mean, I would say I would recommend exactly what you described. right? Like if you're doing the process of scrubbing, if you're essentially, limiting kind of data that you're seeing, if it's something as simple as, just first name, last name, email, I would say first use case I want to understand is that like, does you know, does that data need to be that basic? Right? Like I don't know if you're familiar with like a snowfakery, right? But a tool like Snowfaker can create millions of fake records at any given time. And I've actually done distributed denial of service on, some screen flows using tool like Snowfaker, where it's just creating it and injecting, creating, injecting, creating, injecting, creating, injecting, right? It's part of some of the spoof methodologies even our teams use. But I would say, in the end, like you're following the patterns the best you can, right? You're doing that scrub, right? You're utilizing your best judgment as an experienced individual, as an experienced architect, and you're going to essentially, test it out in sandbox and then see how well it performs in production, right? So I'd say, you know, you're following them, right? For based on what you described. Now, if you would have started with, well, what pattern should I look at? If I want to grab lead data, then we can go a different route. But yeah, I mean, if you're following those specific patterns of like scrubbing that data, validating this is about a human being, utilizing subflows when you can, limiting system context, then yeah, you're doing everything right. Matt, do you have anything?
So that last piece makes it sound like you still recommend putting the actual DML elements in a subflow.
I would like it's again, it's more of I mean, I'm talking about a best practice, right? Like we recommend trying to get out of system context as much as possible, right? I'm sorry, trying to get out, yeah, trying to out as much as possible, right? In the context of a digital experience, right? It's something we'd suggest, whether or not you can or cannot follow it based on a nuanced use case, like you'll have to figure that out, right? That's why, when we talk about patterns and anti-patterns, we talk about them not in the scope of what you've done is broken, therefore you need to fix it, right? It's more of like it's probably not as performant as it could be, or as secure as it could be, or as this as it could be, right? So to got to get it closer towards it. So yeah, I mean, in the end, you're going to make judgment. Like the only reason that we recommend subflows is best practice, same way we often recommend if you're using Apex and, and like other tools, best practice using more async Apex is once again, just to keep it away from the context of the guest user as much as possible. Like, is that perfect? No, but it's a best practice that we just try to put out there to assure that if you're going to build, that's the best path to build. But there's always use cases to get around it.
Awesome.
And
Thank you.
I think
Appreciate
best practices are I think best practices are just that, right? It's a best practices in the most ideal situation that you should use. And does that mean you can always use those same best practices? No, right? But I mean, that's where you should start. And then you start looking at, okay, well, maybe in this certain case, I can't use that best practice. Maybe there's a secondary best practice or mid practice you can use. It's in the middle. I've just evaluate the risk. What would that be exposing for you? And then you have to make just really a judgment what's best for your business at that point. What you're doing. Like I think I like analogies. I'll say like your doctor says it's the best practice to go running because it's good for your heart, right? But what if you have a bad heart already? What if you have a bad knee? You can't go running. But there's still other ways that you can exercise to maintain good health, right? I think the same thing's true about building secure solutions on the platform. I mean, let's just look at it that same way. So also, I think just with the architect, same thing. The practices are not right for every business. Some businesses have different levels of tolerance. Some businesses have different technologies. So just do what's right for your business.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to give a shout out to Snowfakery. Snowfakery is a Commons project supported by the volunteers in the community. I'm a Commons contributor myself for another project. So look them up. If somebody has the link, please share them in chat. They are an excellent solution. So Bobby, would you like to come on and ask your follow-up questions, please?
Sure, I have a couple, but I'm gonna go off of Yumi's question. I don't think we asked, or I don't think like the heart of at least where I look at Yumi's question was answered. I think we this was about passing in URL parameters, and we talked a lot about like sanitizing that and the data coming into the URL. But I think the second part of his question was, we have two different options to display data in an Experience Cloud site. We can either go to sharing rules and kind of grant blanket access to this object, and then that object is accessible even outside of our flows, just regularly through our Experience Cloud site. What pattern do you recommend when his basic solution is he just wants to show some public order information, to say people want to go to a site and see what the status of their order is? Maybe it doesn't show anything besides I can search for my order number and the status is packed or ready or still in progress. But it would seem to me that it's actually more secure to put that security just in that flow, so that some system admin can't go expose more fields. I can handle in the flow, just pass an order number, just pass in the status, and I'm granting system mode on that flow so that they can do that one thing. But it seems like more things can go wrong if I go the route of sharing rules. And so that's the pattern that I usually take, but I'm interested in how you all would process that.
Well, I could have a lot of fun with this one. So I think Shobi already knows where I'm going to go on this one. So let's say you have a flow that has an order number input exposed. I could go open up my trusty tool Burp Suite and start automating, just passing, starting from 1 and start counting up, passing orders into it. And I start getting a lot of customers, different orders out in mass already. So I would never, expose any kind of parameter that would return me any kind of data that in any way, shape, and form could be construed sensitive in a flow. In this specific use case, I would make sure that it was an authenticated, makes them authenticate to be able to retrieve orders. Maybe there's a more simplistic example you have, Bobby, that wouldn't be showing stuff like that was sensitive data. I think that's the biggest problem that I see a lot of out there, is they're having ways that people can get to sensitive data from the guest user by supplying some input, or by sharing. Like you said, sharing rules is even worse, because I can just start querying records. I think if you have a choice, I do neither. But I think again, it's going back to what kind of data can they get to. In this case, I would definitely put it that behind a gate. So
Yeah. I mean, like, it's interesting that you talk about order, right? Like order. So, I mean, leads, contact records, these are universally CRM data, right? But when it comes to like order data, right, I would probably follow the same exact patterns and methods of security that in Amazon or even that exists on our Commerce Cloud capabilities, right? Where you cannot access that data without authentication. Because I think a lot of this right now, we're talking about flows in the context of guest user. Well, what if a guest user can't remember their login and they need to access their order data? Make them, force them to do it, right? Because that is, once again, it goes back to that principle of least privilege, right? And that zero trust architecture. Just don't trust that, like, yeah, I've got the order data and it is, it's order data. Like if someone sent me an order number of like 00468, and I'm like, you know what? I wonder if I can find out what the address is for 00469. I'm betting I can on that page. I'm 100% betting I can, because I have, right? Snowfakery is a powerful tool for doing that kind of thing. Suggested again. So, for creating that kind of like, automated numbered data, right? Sometimes it doesn't get randomized. So I would say force an auth, right? Force an auth, focus on zero trust, right? Like, and yeah, like it's, simple as that.
I was on mute, sorry. Well, thank you very much for all this valuable information. We are approaching the end of the session, and unfortunately, I have not been able to make it to all the questions in the chat. We have still more than 50 people online. This is incredible. Thank you very much for the interest. I guess we're going to have to come up with a solution later on, if we could support this to answer some of these questions, maybe with blog posts later, right? Apparently there is a lot of interest in the community to find out further on this very important topic. So final words, Matt?
I guess just I'm going to echo things I've been saying the whole time, is just just be constantly thinking about security. It's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. It should be always top of your mind. It should always be security first, not security last. I think, what I was saying, just because I would say there's no one size fits all. Don't try to make security be a one size fits all. It should be, case by case basis, but understanding what are the overall overarching principles of your organization. Don't look at just technology, look at policy. If you look at well architected, it focuses a lot on policy. So if I have a user, what's the policy to provision? What's the policy to deprovision? What's our encryption policy? You should have policies around your technology. The technology is not going to fit your problem if you don't have the policies to back it up.
Yeah, Shobi?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, number one, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andy, for this join. I would say, echo Matt's points, right? Utilizing the well-architected framework, utilizing, secure, the topic within the framework, really focusing on technology security, compliance, right? We didn't talk about compliance a ton, but how is that security working for what your organization needs to do? And then resilience. How can your organization actually respond to when something happens? And the reason that this is really top of mind for folks like myself at Salesforce is, if I don't know if anybody's heard, but like we've recently come out with some great innovation around this tool called artificial intelligence, specifically a kind of tool called generative. I don't know if anybody's heard anything about that. But what's interesting about generative is that I know we're talking about screen flows with the guest user. The reason this topic got me excited, because a lot of us are actually looking at what happens when a prompt goes on a flow in the context of a guest user, and I can type whatever I want and get back whatever I'm getting back with autonomous agents, and it's creating data, and I can't verify if it's going to say anything of value back to me or if it's going to say something horrible that I should adhere to, right? So a lot of the same process that we use around trust and ethics go simply beyond when we, like right now, it's in the scope of a screen flow, which talk about zero trust, principle of least privilege when it comes to data. But as that innovation comes out, as all of a sudden, you're creating that flow utilizing generative, it's creating prompts with generative. All of a sudden, that's coming into your applications. Now, all of a sudden, these become like, should I? To, if I don't, we are in big trouble. So, got to keep folks like Matt busy. So simple as that. But yeah, that was about it. So, and if anybody's interested in talking more about that, ping me out. Dan, you can find me out there. Like, if you want to talk more about Einstein and all these tools, it's always a fun topic. I've been talking about people lately inside of Salesforce and outside. So I think that's about it.
Well, thank you very much, folks. And this session was recorded and it's going to be shared on both on LinkedIn and YouTube. In fact, your LinkedIn session link is already going to be a recording after this, so you can share this with your colleagues and friends. I would like to thank everybody for tuning in. Thank you very much, Matt and Shobi, for giving us your time, valuable time, and have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.